Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Jeffrey James Higgins, author of Unseen. Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Paul. I appreciate you having me on. I really enjoy your podcast.
Thank you very much. Are you ready to get started?
Sure, let's go.
All right. Question number 1. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
You know, that's a great question. There's so many diverse skill sets that a writer needs today, from, actually coming up with the story and writing and editing, querying agents, finding a publisher, building a platform, public speaking that's involved with trying to sell your book and marketing it. I think it's really easy to get lost in sort of the business of being a writer. And a lot of times people forget the most critical piece, which is really the craft of writing. So, I'd recommend that aspiring writers and, any writer, you should be, learning throughout your career, but they should focus on improving their craft. Because even if you're lucky enough to get a good agent and to be acquired by one of the big publishing houses, or whether you're self-publishing and have your book out there, it's still not going to be that successful unless the book itself is pretty good. I knew as a child that I wanted to be a writer. Probably like most writers, I remember my parents telling me telling me stories at night and reading me stories, and I always took refuge in books as a child. And then I worked as a reporter as my first professional job. So I was a professional writer for years, and then I got into law enforcement and spent 25 years doing mostly counterterrorism. And just 2 years ago, I got back into writing. And so I had to relearn the craft, because there's a huge difference between writing intelligence reports and actually writing fiction or nonfiction. I've done both. So I've written 3 books in the last 2 years, and I feel like my writing has improved a lot, but only because I focus on how to improve the craft. And by that I mean plot and structure and character development, and how to introduce background into your story without killing the pace, and the sound of your writing, how to write realistic dialogue, how to do good description but not too much of it, how to make your prose work. And by focusing every day, I'm reading books about writing or podcasts or listening to authors. I feel like I go back now in things that I even wrote 6 months ago, I'm embarrassed by, and I've had good feedback. I've been in 4 literary magazines over the last year, and I've been a finalist for some of my essays, and some of the traditional publishing editors that have contacted me have been very positive about my writing. So I'm getting good feedback, but you can always improve. And I think that's really critical. You have to learn how to, not just develop a good plot, but learn how to put together good character arcs and learn how to tell a story, and especially within the genre. My first book was the Narco-Terrorist, which is a nonfiction book about the first narco-terrorism arrest. And that was a case that I was involved in. I was a case agent on it. And then after that, I wrote 2 thrillers, which my agent has one hopefully going out for submission soon, and I'm about to send him the second one. And because they're thrillers, there's certain conventions within that genre that readers are expecting. So if you don't know those and you don't learn those, readers are going to be disappointed when they finally get your book.
Well, Jeffrey, you bring up a lot of great points, because it's a lot harder to write fiction than nonfiction. Nonfiction, fairly easy, fairly straightforward with things you want to get out, especially if you're writing a business book. But if you are writing fiction, you're right. It's not only the grammar, it's not only the different tenses and everything, but what the main issue is the character development and making sure that it's storyboarded and that everything makes sense going through, and that you don't have any plot holes. Now, with these books that you've done 3 in the past 2 years, they've all been fiction, is that correct?
No, so the first one was called The Narco-Terrorist. So this is narrative nonfiction. I mean, hopefully it reads like a thriller, but it's about the first really from 9/11. I was at the World Trade Center on 9/11, so it's from that time. I was with DEA, and how the law enforcement community was resistant to getting into some counterterrorism, like DEA specifically. And then, I spent years in Afghanistan, and so it's showing the symbiotic relationship between terrorists and drug trafficking. and then culminating with the first arrest and then conviction of the first narco-terrorist, first person convicted under the new narco-terrorism laws. So, I mean, you're right. Like it's easier because there's your story. I have it, but it's also harder in a lot of ways because you have to be really careful. You have to footnote everything. You have to do interviews. You're telling the reader this is nonfiction, so you have to be really careful in how flawed your own memory can be. So there's a lot of corroboration that you have to do, and then you also have to make it fit a real story arc. The plot itself has to have a beginning, middle, and end, and it has to be satisfying to a reader. So that's one way that fiction, I think, is much easier, because you can, when you're doing fiction, you can, if you need to have a reversal of fortune or something, you just put it in there. You just make it up. So they're both difficult, but difficult in different ways.
Absolutely. What do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
Well, the whole process is pretty daunting. I've written, I think I've had 18 or 19 articles published since I started writing again. It's been just under 2 years. So I've been published a lot in magazines, but I have these 3 books out, and they haven't been published yet, although I'm very optimistic, and I have a really terrific agent at Inkwell Management. But probably the thing that's most frustrating for me about it is just the time that's involved. Like I'll take the book that my agent has now. He's getting ready to submit. It's fiction. It's a thriller. It's about a rookie homicide detective in Washington, D.C. who investigates a murder. Then there's a string of murders, and he discovers the one thing linking all these victims together is radical Islam. And so it's a murder mystery, but it has a larger conspiracy over it. So it deals with some real issues that are going on, because I spent a lot of time in counterterrorism. So it's a fictional story, but about real issues. And it took me 2 months to write the first draft. I have a really good writing practice. I get up every morning. I write 7 days a week. I write 6 hours a day. I have word counts that I shoot for. But then after I wrote the first draft, it took me 2 months for that, 3 months to edit it. Developmental edit, and then copy edits, and then I sent it out to beta readers and had to give them time to read it. Then I took their critiques and made changes and other edits. So I think I ended up doing probably 12 or 15 drafts of the book. And then I sent it to my agent, and now I'm waiting for him to go through it, and he'll come back with his critique, and then I'll make his changes based on what he's telling me. Then it goes out to publishers, and you know how long that process can take, right? That can be 9 months, a year and a half from the time it's acquired by one of the publishing houses. So the total time, if you're going the traditional publishing route, is a couple of years. I mean, if you're lucky, it's a year and a half. It could be significantly longer than that too. So it makes self-publishing look attractive, where you can just, once you have that final product that you're comfortable with, that you can just get it out there to the public. But so that's the time involved is the most frustrating part.
Yeah, indie and hybrid are 2 of the ways that I always like to recommend, mainly because it's the creative process. You have a lot more control, you can get out a lot quicker. But for those that want to go the traditional route, there's a lot of great benefits with that as well. But I think the biggest challenge is the fact that it does take anywhere from a year and a half to even 3 to 5 years, especially as you have multiple books submitted.
Right. It takes an awfully long time. And the benefits are, you're going through a more strenuous vetting process, and you're dealing with really professional editors, which of course you can hire on your own if you're self-publishing. But when you get a product out, you've had a lot more professional eyes on it. So I think it can be a little better. I read a lot of independently published books, and some of them are outstanding, just excellent. But they really can. There's a lot of bad books out there. There's a lot of books, and I think we've all read them, where you read, I read probably 60, 70 books a year, but I also read the beginnings of books all the time. I get free reads from BookBub and Goodreads and places like that, and I always read the beginning. And you can read the first 2 or 3 paragraphs and see just bad craft, and know that it's going to be a painful book to read. And if you were going through an editor, whether it was an independent editor that you hired, for self-publishing, or whether it's through one of the traditional publishing route, you're going to have someone who's going to catch that and be able to point it out to you, because it's really hard to edit your own stuff. It's a whole different skill set, and it's over the last 2 years, I've spent a significant amount of time trying to figure out how to edit my own writing, and there are a lot of little tricks you can do, like printing it out, reading lines backwards, having other people take a look at it. Going slowly word by word, so your mind actually sees what's written on the paper as opposed to what you think is on the paper. But it's truly difficult.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I think one of the biggest mistakes people that go the indie route, they don't invest the money in a proper editor. For every single one of my books, all my clients' books, we have editors on staff that are specifically experts with editing, because you have to have three keys, I feel, to have a great book. One, having an amazing book cover, a very clear book title. Subtitle has to be the benefit of the book, mainly focusing more on the nonfiction side. But the second part of that is you have to have a well edited book, because that is what's going to be the difference between your book being Bush League and looking big league. It's all about the presentation, and you must have it well edited. And for anyone that's listening to this show, if you're going to invest in anything, invest in the editing, because that is what makes your draft, your manuscript, a proper book. And then having a great book description that helps sell the book. But I mean, I can't emphasize the importance, I know you're talking about it as well, of having the book professionally edited. Don't do it yourself. If you want to proof it yourself after it's done, that's fine. Read it out loud, make an audiobook version, whatever you need to do. But for goodness sake, get that book edited professionally. Spend the money.
Yeah, I think that's a really terrific advice. I mean, the problem becomes for someone who's self-publishing and a writer, you've probably seen the latest like Authors Guild surveys about the income that writers are having. You know, it's gone down significantly over the last 10 years. And you can shell out a lot of money for editing. So you have to be really careful. You have to be able to make sure the editor that's looking at it is worth the money that you're putting into it. But I couldn't agree more. It's really difficult to do yourself. And the other thing is when you're writing, if you're writing and paying attention to craft, the more you write, the better you get at it.
Yep.
So like by the time I finish a 2-month draft and go back, I mean, well, first when I put a draft down, I realized, you know, I don't hold myself to a too high a standard. I just want to get the story on paper, then I can go back and polish it and make it sound better. But still, my writing, just from having written like, you know, 110,000 words or whatever, from the beginning to the end, it's better when I go back and look at it again. And that happens every single time. So I'll look at it. I'll go through a book 12 or 15 times. I'll have, you know, I have a dozen beta readers. I'm part of a really good writing critique group with some really professional published authors that are terrific, and they go through it. You know, so you have a lot of eyes look at it, and then I go back, you know, one final time before I send it out, and I find something on every page. You know, not like bad grammar or mistakes, but things that maybe are passive instead of active, or you know, just some part of the craft that could be better. And you get to a point where you wonder how many times should you actually have to review something. I heard, I think it was Steve Barry, I'm not sure who it was, but he said he goes through his books 80 times, 70 to 80 times before he sends them to an agent. You know, and it's excruciating. If you're a writer and you do that, you know, just read the same book like 20 times, and it's incredibly boring, but it's absolutely necessary. And that professional writer gives you that extra set of eyes and can point out things, especially developmental problems that you probably have blind spots to.
Well, you mentioned you have an agent, so what I'd like to ask you a little bit about that process. So how were you able to get an agent? Because a lot of listeners in the show, I get that question quite often. It's like, hey, how do I get an agent? So what are some things that you would recommend in that process?
Well, you know, I was really fortunate. It went pretty smoothly for me. I mean, I think I had a little bit of an advantage because the first book, The Narco Terrorist, I wrote, is a book that nobody else in the world could have written. You know, I was the case agent on this specific case. I spent 25 years in law enforcement. I briefed members of Congress. I briefed you know, the NATO. You know, like I knew what I was talking about, and it was a very unique story. So I think in that respect, it's a little different than if I just come forward with as a new author with some fiction. But what I did was I researched agents, and there's a lot of like agent query. There's a lot of resources out there. Writer's Market. I think the one that was most helpful to me was the Publisher's Marketplace, and you can query deal makers based on the genre and the type of deal you're looking for, and really narrow it down and look at all the agents that are available. You know, and look at what they've done, how many deals they've done, how many 6-figure deals they've done, and narrow it down to a short list of people, and then, you know, write the query letter. And the query letter is an art all by itself. Like, how do you boil down a 100,000 word, you know, a book into a few sentences that can really hook the agent and not sound like a million other books that have been written in the past? And then how do you summarize it in a paragraph? And how do you get your platform and, you know, all the things you bring as a writer into that letter? It's really difficult. It's a 1-page query letter. So I sent out, I picked my top 10 and I sent it out to 10 people, and I got 3 agents interested within 3 days. So I mean, I think that was really, really lucky. I don't know that would happen all the time, and so I feel like I'm fortunate. And then I ended up going with an agent who another author introduced me to. He'd recommended my work and sent it to him, and he was interested. So I'm pretty happy. Inkwell Management is a terrific literary agency, but there are a lot of them out there, and we'll see how it goes.
What was the name of the company again?
It's Inkwell Management.
I've heard good things about them.
Yeah, they're good. They're one of the bigger ones, and they're in New York. They're a New York firm, and my agent splits his time between New York and Texas, and he's actually one of the, if you look at like the deals over the last 12 months, he's one of the, I think he's like ranked number 4 or 5 for agents in the thriller genre, which is where I'm working now.
Well, one area that we haven't really touched on too much so far is about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launches that has worked well.
Well, so I have the nonfiction book that's out for submission right now, and then I have these 2 pieces of fiction which I'm hoping to get submitted to publishers soon. So I'm gonna market them all differently. Like the narrative nonfiction is very specific. It's got a different there's overlap, but it's got a different audience than my fiction. So I'm going to use my professional credentials and go after like the standard stuff. I'm gonna get blurbs. I'm gonna have reviews. But the people I'm gonna get to write these are going to be like influence makers, opinion makers, politicians that I know, people that are in law enforcement and in the military, and then I'm going to take that and target readers who I know are interested in this kind of thing, like people in law enforcement associations. And the specific reader, the subsets of readers that I know are probably the most likely to buy this. And so I'm in a lot of associations. I'm active. I publish a lot of articles in like law enforcement magazines and things like that. So I'll specifically target them, and I'll also, because it's nonfiction, I've been on CNN and interviewed by the New York Times and Bloomberg and a lot of like mainstream media. So I'll use that entree that I have because of my expertise in it to go back on into these media outlets and push the book. So it's a really interesting story that deals with the nexus between drugs and terrorism, and it's really important today in 2019 about what are we going to do and how do we tackle the same issues that we have. Now, for the fiction, I'm going to do it a little differently because I'll target those same groups, but when I'm looking, when I'm doing book signings or when I'm looking for blurbs and reviews and things, I'll go after like writers that I know or writers that I'll be introduced to in the thriller genre, and so I'll pitch it slightly differently because it's fiction.
What's nice is the fact that you are utilizing all these different channels. I mean, the fact that you've been interviewed by CNN as a subject matter expert, that already gives you that hook to go back with them and go, hey, I have this book out. This is what I'd like to talk about. And the fact that you're emphasizing essentially like a 30-second pitch, just like you would a Q letter, where you're really focusing on a 30-second pitch, how this is going to help them, how it's going to benefit. And then from that point, it really does help you with selling that opportunity.
Right. I'm fortunate that from my professional connections, I've been able to have these media contacts. Like I was in an episode of CNN Declassified last year, and they expressed some interest in maybe doing an episode just on this book. And I've had, I don't know, probably 20 different podcasts and radio shows say they'd love to have me on once the book comes out, because it's really an interesting story. I mean, I went from working in New York City and then being at the World Trade Center when the towers came down and carrying bodies out of the rubble, to realizing that I had to focus on terrorism. And then I ended up going to Afghanistan, and I was there like 4 or 5 days, and I ended up wrestling a suicide bomber who's trying to detonate his bomb while we were fighting. And then pushing my agency and fighting with the intelligence and law enforcement and military communities to get them to understand the nexus with drug trafficking and how that's really the engine that drives all this terrorism. And then ending with the first precedent-setting case where we actually charged someone with narco-terrorism. So it's a good story. It'll be fun. And then, for the fiction, like the first book I told you about with the murders in Washington, D.C., it's talking about like radical Islam and infiltration. And it's a real thing involving the Muslim Brotherhood that's going on worldwide. And so it's, I have a feeling I might even do the Michael Crichton thing and actually footnote the book, even though it's a novel, because all the issues I'm talking about are real and provable with, documented evidence and public trials and things. So I haven't decided if I'm going to add that. I'm going to talk to my agent about it, but I might actually footnote it. But a specific group of people that would be interested in that are people who are concerned about radical Islam. And when I say radical Islam, I'm talking about a fundamental version that pushes Sharia law and pushes violence, not Islam in general or Muslims in general. And so I'm going to go after organizations, and I have a lot of contacts in think tanks, and surprisingly, my wife Cynthia Farrahat's actually an expert in the Muslim Brotherhood and an expert in radical Islam. So I have my own subject matter expert in my house, which is really terrific. And she briefs Congress. She's testified before Congress, and she is a fellow in a think tank, the Middle East Forum. And so we have lots of contacts within like the wonky kind of the policy community within DC. So I'm going to go after like activist groups that people I know and say, hey, your people are concerned about radical Islam. Here's a fun novel that talks about real issues that's exactly the kind of thing they want, and see if we can kind of come up with a win-win situation where they help me market it directly to their readership or to their members.
Tell you what, I think you're going to be in great shape with these books. You definitely know your market and you know how to market to them. That's critical.
Yeah, I think knowing who wants to buy your book is very important. And if you don't know that, you're just kind of throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks.
The spaghetti mentality.
That's right.
Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So, what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
You had mentioned that question. It's on all of your podcasts. It's really hard for a bibliophile. I told you I read up to 70 books a year, and I've been doing this my whole life. I read all the time, so there's so many. I think when I was a kid, I had the bug early. I remember writing when I was 6 and 7 years old. I was writing stories and getting up in the middle of the night after my parents put me to bed and sneaking with a light and writing stories. So I got it early. And one of the earliest books I remember that really sparked my imagination was Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. It sort of brought this world of adventure to me, and a young boy stowing away on a ship, and so I read a lot of like adventure, a lot of like Jack London and things like that when I was a child. As an adult, I would probably pick Atlas Shrugged, just because it's a really significant political work that's was written in 1957, I think, and it's as relevant today as it was then. It's a novel kind of in the old Russian tradition, because they couldn't write politics, so everything had to be fiction, but talking about big ideas about the effectiveness of like economic and political systems that allow people to trade freely amongst themselves, and how that turns into human flourishing. So it's really a warning about the dangers of central planning and cronyism and over government regulation. So it's a really important book today, especially when we're doing things like talking about tariffs and talking about the effects of a growing government on the economy.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
Well, I mentioned Atlas Shrugged, so that's Ayn Rand. So I'll give you from Ayn Rand. She said, "Men cannot be enslaved politically until they have been disarmed ideologically." And that's from Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which, by the way, is a book I recommend everybody read. There's so many straw man arguments about capitalism, and people don't really understand what it means politically and economically. So it's a terrific book. But you have to understand the history and the philosophy of how people flourish. Like every year, the Heritage Foundation puts out a big freedom index, and it's broken down by regulations, and there's a dozen different categories they look at, or more. And there's a almost direct correlation between people's freedom and their well-being across the world, across countries. So there's something there about being able to pursue your own happiness. It's a big part of Western civilization, and there's a reason for it. And so but understanding capitalism like this Ayn Rand book, I think, is really important for people.
Well, Jeffrey, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show today. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Probably the best way is my website. It's jeffreyjameshiggins.com. It's Jeffrey James Higgins, Higgins. And I check that every day, and I post my articles when they're published, and I'll put some updates once these books get acquired, so people know where they can find them. You can also find me on Twitter at Jeffrey J. Higgins and on Facebook at Jeffrey James Higgins.
Jeffrey, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.